It's Erev Shabbos. Let's get going. We are on Daf Ayin Amud Aleph. And in yesterday's Daf, at the very bottom, Rava had posed a question. And the question was that if you take a stalk of wheat, now normally you're not supposed to tithe wheat until you remove it from the stalk, remove the husk, pile it up. But a person jumped the gun. He accumulated stalks of grain and tithed the stalks, which, okay, legally it's done. Legally it's now tithed. It's now considered to be chulin. It's tithed produce. But then he takes one of those stalks and he sticks it into the ground and replants it so that it continues growing. So presumably, the additional growth is subject to additional tithes. But the question is, what about the original? Does the original now become subsidiary to the new growth, such that it too needs to be retithed? Or do we say that it retains its status of being tithed produce and you only need to tithe the new growth? So that's the debate, that's the question that Rava poses. And so now we have to go further. We're going to ask a similar question based on that question. So we're up to sort of like the 10th line in the Gemara. Rabbi Chanina bar Minyumi, Amar le Rabbi Chanina bar Minyumi le'Abaye. He said as follows: Atzit she'ino nakov mahu. What is the law if you have a produce growing in a container that is above ground, that is not connected to the soil? We call that, one of the ways that can be done is through hydroponics. But you can do that, in the times of the Gemara, you would take a potted plant, a flower pot, and you would grow produce in it. Midioraisa, it's not subject to any agricultural law because it's not attached to the ground. So the question is that subject to tithes or not? So the Gemara says, I don't even understand your question. Ilo nakov, halo nakov. If there are no holes on the bottom to attach it to the ground, it's completely detached, so there's no subjectivity to Meiser, no matter how you look at it. So Dilma Chazer v'nakvo ka'amart. Maybe what your question really is what if you have a stalk of wheat that's growing in a flower pot that is not connected to the ground at all, and then afterwards you don't do anything to remove the stalk, but you drill holes in the bottom of the flower pot and leave it on the ground, and then there's new growth that adds on to that. So the question, therefore, is, maybe this is the same question as Rava was asking before, where you took a tithed stalk, replanted it, and new growth comes. Do you have to tithe now from the old part of the stalk or just from the new part of the stalk? Similarly, the question is, now that you've got new growth from this stalk that was previously patur from Meiser, but that new growth is chayiv in Meiser, does that also obligate the stuff that had grown previously in the detached container? So hacha chada zuriyahi ichburehu dekamichbera va'oile hasam shtei zriyos ninu. So the Gemara's answer, if I'm understanding Rashi correctly, is that there's no comparison. The only reason Rava asked his question that possibly you would be obligated to retithe the old stalk that had been previously tithed is because you've done a new act of planting in the ground. Here, there's no act that's being done with the stalk that had previously been detached from the ground, and now all you've done is drilled holes in the bottom of the pot. So you haven't done anything active with the stalk to replant it or to do anything to it directly. And therefore, and that's the reason why, even if you have Rava's question, you would not have a question over here, and therefore you would not have to tithe the older growth, the growth that grew in the detached pot. You would only have to tithe the growth that was added after the holes were drilled.
Could you not say that the plant is now being sustained by the earth once the holes have been drilled?
It is, but that's only vis-a-vis the stuff that's growing newly. The stuff the grain that already grew, you're right, doesn't need the sustenance of the soil because it's fully mature grain.
Thank you.
Next, Boy Rabbi Avo. Now Rabbi Avo asks the following question. Shiboles shemarcha b'kri v'shasla v'kara le Hashem b'mechuber mahu. Related question. Again, a guy jumps the gun. Instead of removing the grain from the stalks, he just piles up and accumulates stalks of grain. And in so doing, he's demonstrated that this is now ready for tithing. Normally what you do is the stalks are threshed, and after the threshing, you accumulate it in the barn. But here he didn't thresh, he just accumulated stalks in the barn. And so now he declares, which you're allowed to do, by the way, with regular grain. You don't have to actually physically remove truma. You could just say, I hereby declare that X percentage of the grain in the north side of this pile shall be designated as truma, right? So what if he does that to the grain that's in this pile of stalks? And then he goes ahead and takes one of those stalks that he had previously designated as truma, and he plants it in the ground. So he takes a stalk that he had designated as truma, plants it now in the ground. Kevin demarcha tavlala, kikara Allah shem kadshala. Now, would you argue is that since he accumulated piles of stalks, he has made it subject to now being tithable, it's tevel, and once he declared it to be that stalk to be truma, itaka is truma, and therefore by replanting that stalk, it does not remove its status of truma. Odil makeben deshasla pakale tavla mina. Or could you argue that by replanting that stalk, the status of tevel is removed from it, and therefore it is no longer possible to call it truma? So Amri le Rabbanan le Abaye.
What would the svara be? How could you even do that? It's not even his.
Right. Well, the argument is that on the one hand it's sanctified, but on the other hand, by treating it as a plantable item, you're sort of retroactively reversing the status that you had previously assigned it. Because you're now treating it, normally something that is truma is not meant to be reinserted into the ground unless you plant it as a kernel. But here you're not planting it as a kernel, you're treating it now as an unfinished product that's not subject to tithing. So you're sort of reversing your previous action. So that's really the Gemara's question. Can you sort of reverse it? By replanting it, you're demonstrating that everything that you did before is to be canceled out. So, Amri le Rabbanan la Abaye, im kain motzinu truma b'mechuber lekarka, utnan lo motzinu truma b'mechuber lekarka. So the rabbi said back to Abaye, that's not possible that you could consider this to be truma while it's planted in the ground, because there's a Mishnah that says that there's no such thing as truma that's planted, that's growing from the ground. It's impossible. So Abaye's response is, Amar le, kitanya hahi le'inyan ichyu ve'misa v'chomesh, di italish va'achel talushu v'gachen va'achel batla daito etzel kol adam. So Abaye says, you're not understanding that Mishnah. That Mishnah is not stating definitively that it's impossible to have a scenario where a growing produce can be truma that's growing in the ground. That's not what the Mishnah is saying. What the Mishnah is saying is that it's impossible to eat something that's growing presently from the ground and receive the penalty for eating truma. In other words, it's possible for something to be growing truma, but it's not possible that if I eat it as a growing substance, that I will incur the penalty for eating truma. Now, what is the penalty? If I, as a non-Kohen, go ahead and eat a Kohen's truma, what's my penalty? Misa bidei shamayim, a heavenly punishment, and I have to pay the value of what I ate plus a chaimesh plus a fifth of the value. That is what the Mishnah is saying is not possible. Why? Because if you pull it out of the ground in order to eat it, it's no longer considered to be a growing item from the ground. And that's normally how people eat. You pull something out of the ground, you pull a radish out of the ground and you take a bite out of it. You don't eat it while it's still growing in the ground. And if you were to bend over, get down on all fours and start nibbling on a growing stalk of wheat, we would say, but ladaito etzel kadal of them. That's not normative eating. So you only get a normative punishment for normative behavior, but for non-normative behavior, we can't give you the Torah's penalty. That's what the Mishnah means. So the Gemara says, but if that's the way you're interpreting the Mishnah, umayshna midichsiv apinkasa deilfa, beitzi nevelas haof hatorah mikzasin bachutz mikzasin bifnim, mibifnim metamin begadim abeis habliya, mibachutz ein metamin begadim abeis habliya. So the Gemara says, now wait a minute, if you're saying that it's non-normative to eat a stalk when it's growing, and that's why you don't get a normative penalty for it. Why is that any different from the halacha that we found written on Ilfa's notebook? Ilfa was a great sage in the times of Rabbi Yochanan, so his piskei halacha are considered definitive. And he wrote in his notebook that if you find a dead chicken, now this is not a slaughtered chicken, this is a chicken that died of natural causes, so it's a nevela, right? If you eat nevela sa'of, when you swallow that first piece of nevela sa'of, you become tameh and your clothing become tameh. So the question is as follows: you find a dead chicken, and you find that it died in the stage when it was in the process of laying an egg. So portion of the egg is protruding out of the orifice, and a portion of the egg is still within the hen's body. What is the orifice from which the egg comes out of? What do you call that? Does anyone know? I wish I knew. I don't know what it's called. So the statement of Ilfa was that if I eat the portion of the egg that is protruding out of the chicken, then I'm not considered to be eating nevela. But if I insert my face into the orifice of the chicken and nibble on the egg while it's still inside the chicken's body, then that's considered to be eating nevela, and I will become tameh through swallowing that portion of the egg. And so the question is basically this: if you're telling me that you don't get penalties for non-normative eating, for abnormal eating, this sounds to be the most abnormal kind of eating that you can think of, and yet you still become tameh as a result. So why is that? So the Gemara's answer is very bizarre. Talish avidi inshi da'achli, hachi b'mechumer lo avidi inshi da'achli. People could eat eggs that way, but something that's growing from the ground, people don't eat. So when you look at that statement, it's very bizarre. What does the Gemara really mean? So what I'm thinking what the Gemara is saying is that it is possible, like if you have a shechted chicken and an egg it was in the process of laying an egg when you shechted it, that's possible. And it's also possible that you could just take that whole chicken, right, pull out its kishkas and throw it into a pot and make a chicken soup. And then when you want to eat the chicken, you could find the portion of the egg still inside the chicken and you would eat it that way. That's not unusual. So therefore, even though sticking your face into the chicken's orifice to eat the egg that way is totally abnormal for a nevela, but eating it this way is not abnormal. And therefore, it's considered to be normative eating as far as becoming tameh. But eating something that's attached to the ground is never normative, and therefore you don't get the normative penalty. Amar Rav Tivyumi bar Kisna, Amar Shmuel, Hazoreya kilayim ba'atzit she'eno nakuv aser. Related statement having to do with kilayim. We know kilayim is a forbidden mixture of wheat seed and grape seed growing together. If a person were to plant them in a flower pot, so it's not attached to the ground, so it's aser, which implies that it's only rabbinically prohibited because the Torah only forbids this if it's planted in the ground. This is not planted in the ground, and therefore it's only a rabbinical prohibition. So Amar Abaya Bishlami Yashmin Loika Makas Mardus Midrabanan Shapir. Ela aser Maikam Ashmalan Midrabanan Hi Zriya Havya Zriya. He says, Abaya says, in a sense, in a sarcastic way, Shkoyach, what are you teaching me that I didn't already know? If you would have told me that there's like some new aspect of the fact that there's a rabbinic prohibition, that not only is this rabbinically prohibited, but the rabbis clamp down on this halacha to give you rabbinic lashes, then you'd be telling me a chiddush. Because not for all rabbinic violations do they administer makas mardus. Only for some things do they feel that they need to clamp down and administer makas mardus. So if that's what you were telling me, shkoyach, then I would appreciate it. But that's not what you said. So what are you just teaching me? That there's a rabbinic prohibition of planting kilayim in a flower pot, in an otzit she'eno nakuv? Tanina, I already know that from the Mishnah, because it says, Torah mishe'eno nakuv ala nakuv truma b'yachzor v'yitra. There's a Mishnah that talks about if a person were to grow produce in a flower pot. Let's say he's growing, wheat, and he wants to use that wheat that grew in a flower pot and use that as the truma source for wheat that grew out in the field. So the Mishnah says that rabbinically, if you declared that to be truma, it retains its status as truma, lechumra, but lekula we don't say because it's not really tithable. and therefore you have to go retithe the wheat in the field. So what that essentially tells you is that the Chachamim assigned it a rabbinic status as if it's attached to the ground, but not a biblical status if attached to the ground. So I don't need you to tell me that planting kilayim in a flower pot is subject to a rabbinic violation. That I already know. Anyway, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Hachitim v'hasaorim v'hakusmin v'hashibola shual v'hashofin v'hashifon rather hare'elu chayovin b'chala. Now we're talking about the mitzvah of chala, which is, of course, we know that when you make dough, a certain requisite amount of dough, you have to take challah from it, which is a certain amount of dough from it, and present it to the Kohen as his tithe. It's a dough tithe. What types of grain made into dough are subject to a dough tithe? So the Mishnah says the 5 standard grains. Chitin is wheat, Saorin is barley, Kusmin is translated as spelt, Shibolashul is translated as oats, and Shifon is translated as rye. Okay? Now, umitzdarfin zeh im zeh, and furthermore, if I have a combination of different grains made into a dough, then that can make up the requisite amount that I need in order to tithe challah. Va'asurin b'chadash milifnei ha'omer u'meliksar milifnei ha'pesach. That's the way they changed the girsa. That as far as chadash is concerned, you may not eat any of these grains from the winter harvest until you bring the korban ha'omer. And even as far as the law of harvesting, you're really not allowed to harvest any winter grain until Pesach, until you the first, because the first harvest that you're supposed to have is the Omer harvest, the barley that's harvested for the Korban HaOmer. And therefore you have to leave everything out in the field and defer harvesting any winter growth until you harvest the barley for the Korban HaOmer. Now, im hishrishu kodem la'omer ha'omer matiran, v'im lav asur nad sheyava ha'omer haba. We learned this a couple of days ago. At what stage of growth must the winter grain be in order to be considered sufficiently grown such that when the korban ha'omer is brought, that korban alleviates it of its chadash status? As long as the wheat kernels took root before the korban ha'omer was brought, the bringing of the korban ha'omer removes the chadash status off of that newly growing grain. Let's take a look at but if not, if it hasn't taken root yet, then you have to wait until next year in order for that grain to be permitted. The Gemara now says, Tana, kusmin min chitim shiboloshul v'shifon min sa'orin, period. It's a cryptic statement, and it's a machlokas between Rashi and Rashi as far as what this statement means. What do I mean machlokas Rashi and Rashi? Rashi says one thing in our Maseches, and he says something totally different in Maseches Psachim. In Maseches Psachim, it's much easier to understand, because there Rashi says this is a law vis-a-vis the laws of Truma. We know that there's a basic law. I can't tithe apples for oranges. If I'm tithing, I have to take apples from apples and oranges from oranges. Similarly, if I'm tithing grain, I can't use wheat for barley or barley for wheat. And so therefore, we want to know, are all 5 grains disparate, or are they sort of, the Brisa now basically says there's only 2 different species of grain. There's wheat and there's barley. The other 3 are subcategories of those 2. So a subcategory of wheat is spelt, and a subcategory of barley is rye and oats. And therefore, I can tithe using oats for barley, but I can't tithe oats for wheat, for example. That's what Rashi explains in Maseches Psachim. But over here, Rashi says that it's a din in challah. And even though the Mishnah had told me that I can combine all the different 5 grains together to get the requisite amount to take challah, here the Brisa is qualifying that, and it's saying no, only if it's the same subcategory. So I can use oats and rye and barley together to get the requisite amount for taking challah, and I can use spelt and wheat together to get the requisite amount. But if I have a combination of wheat and barley, then I can't conjoin them to get the requisite amount to take challah. That's the way Rashi learns over here. Now, the Brisa continues and it tells us what the definition of these 5 grains are, translating from the Mishnaic Hebrew into Babylonian Aramaic. So it says, what are kusmin in the Mishnah? That's gulba. What is shifon? Dishra. What is shibola shual? Shibole ta'ala. And like we said before, these are spelt, rye, and oats. Now, honey in orez v'dochen lo, mina honey mili. So it seems like the only grains that are subject to the law of challah are these 5 grains from the Mishnah, which excludes rice and millet. How do you know that rice and millet are excluded? So Amar Reish Lakish, Asya lechem lechem imatzak, sivhacha v'haya ba'acholchem ilechem haaretz, uchsivhasam lechem oni. So the answer is that the word lechem is used by the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach, and the word lechem appears here. Just like by matzah, matzah can only be from the 5 grains, so to here, by the law of challah, it's only subject to challah when it's of the 5 grains. V'hasam gufa minol, and sotaka, how do you know that matzah can only be from the 5 grains? Amar Reish Lakish, v'chein tana devei Rabbi Yishmael, v'chein tana devei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Amar Kra, lo sochalalav chametz, shivasimim tochalalav matzos lechem oni. Because the Torah directly correlates the mitzvah of matzah with the prohibition of chametz on Pesach. And from that I learn that dvarim haboim lidei chimutz adam yotzei ben yidei chavasu bepesach, yatsu elu shein boim lidei chimutz ela lidei sirchon. So therefore, matzah can only be made from something which is subject to leavening. So anything that's not subject to leavening cannot be used for making matzah to fulfill the mitzvah of achilas matzah. Rice and millet do not leaven. They putrefy or they spoil when they are left to leaven. In other words, now the truth is, could you make bread from millet? Could you make bread from rice?
Yes.
For those who are gluten-free, I guess.
But even that's what, essentially we're saying is that the chamisha saminim are gluten. All the others are not gluten.
So you're correlating leavening to gluten,
Yeah.
which I don't know. I mean, maybe scientifically you're correct. I don't know, but the point is that the Gemara is basically saying that these rice and millet do not leaven in the normal leavening process. They do go through some kind of bacterial change, but that's not called leavening.
The gluten is what holds it together so the bread rises.
Okay.
So, I mean, that scientifically, that seems to be what's actually involved.
You may be 100% correct. I have no idea. But
What is yeast anyway?
millet is one of the grain. It's a type of grain.
What, did you put yeast?
Google it. Google it. You'll see what millet is.
Like you feed it to
No.
birds.
No, but you can buy millet for human consumption also. You go to a health food store, they'll sell you
Yes,
millet.
Yeah, millets and a lot of gluten-free foods
Okay.
and beer.
Okay. Thank you. Let us go on. Umitzdarfim zeh im zeh. You can conjoin all the different grains together for the mitzvah of challah. So Tana, now we have a slightly different brisa. Hatavua v'hakemachim v'habetzeikos mitzdarfim zeh im zeh. This brisa says that whole grain and flour and dough can be joined together. Now that can't be referring to the law of challah, because challah only applies to finished dough. So what does this halacha apply to? So lamai hilchas, that's really the Gemara's question. So Amar Rav Kahana le'inyan chadash. It applies to the laws of chadash. So basically what it's saying is, look, if I eat a kazayas of chadash, I get malchus, right? Because I've violated a mitzvah lo saseh. So what form must the chadash be in order for me to violate it? So that's what the brisa means. It can be in any form. It can be a mixture of forms, and I can still get malchus as long as I eat a kazayas of this several different forms, even when they're together. Rav Yosef Amar le'inyan chametz b'Pesach. Rav Yosef says it has to do with eating a kazayas of chametz on Pesach. If I eat leavened whole grain, half a kazayas of leavened whole grain together with a half a kazayas of leavened dough, I get malchus on Pesach. Or I get actually kares, right? Rav Papa Amar le'inyan ma'aser sheni di'i achale chutz l'chom malaki. Rav Papa says it has to do with ma'aser sheni. Ma'aser sheni has to be brought to Jerusalem and consumed there. If I eat ma'aser sheni outside of Jerusalem, I get malchus for it. So if I eat a half a kazayas of whole grain ma'aser sheni and half a kazayas of ma'aser sheni dough, I get malchus for that. That's the chiddush. Rava Amar le'inyan tumas ochlin v'hakamash malan de tevua ukemachin dumya de betzeikos mahasam uchla be'enei avhachanami uchla be'enei. So Rava says, no, I have news for you. That's not what it's talking about. It's telling me a very important chiddush, and that is that whole grain has the same status as dough regarding its status of being connected. Why? Because we know that if I have a food mass that's the size of a kibetza and it touches a sheretz, it becomes tameh and it can make other things tameh as well. But what if I have disparate food particles that are not connected to each other and a sheretz touches them? Then they become tameh, but they don't have the ability to be metameh other things. So the chiddush is that the Bryce is telling me that there's no difference between particles of grain and a chunk of dough. That as long as the particles of grain are touching each other, even though they're separated by a husk, that husk is still considered to be food, such that it's one slab of food that is being touched by a sheretz that can therefore now be metame other things. V'hatanya, and this is really what the Brisa says, chita ben klufa ben she'ena klufa mitzdarefes, sa'ora klufa mitzdarefes she'ena klufa ein mitzdarefes. And the Brisa says that it's specifically designated for wheat. Wheat with the husk, if I have a cluster of wheat grains with their husks, and it touches sheretz, they become tameh and they're metame other things. Why? Because the wheat husk is considered to be an edible item. By contrast, if I have barley kernels that are covered by their husk, the barley husk is so thick and tough that it's not considered to be an edible item. And therefore, each particle is separate from each other, and if a sheretz touches them, they do not have the power to be metame other things. So the Gemara says, oh really? You're making a distinction between barley and wheat? Is this really so, Aini? V'hatana devei Rabbi Yishmael kol zera zerua asher yizareya kederach shebnei adam motzin lizriya chita beklipasa usara beklipasa va'adasham beklipasa. The Brisa seems to say, based on the pasuk which talks about a seed becoming tameh, that even if it's in its natural form, the way I would plant it in the ground for planting, it still has the laws of tumah apply to it, which implies that even whether it's wheat, barley, or lentils, that if the husk of the grain is still surrounding it, all the laws of tumah apply. So it sounds like from this brisa that even barley that's covered by a husk, if it's a cluster of barley grains with their husks, if a sheretz touches it, they will become tameh and be metame other things, in contrast to what you just told me. So the Gemara says, lo kasha ha-balachos ha-biyaveshos. And the Gemara says, no, there's two different types of barley grain. One is moist and one is dried. And Rashi has two different explanations. In one explanation, Rashi says, the moist barley kernel husk is edible. The dry barley husk is dry, and therefore you can't eat it. What?
It's like stones.
It's like stones, and therefore you can't eat it, and that's the difference. Rashi in his second interpretation says just the opposite. He says moist barley husks are thick, and therefore they're inedible. But dried barley husks are crumbly, and therefore it's like the bran, right? And therefore you can eat it. I have oat bran every morning. I think it's very healthy. But anyway, I digress. Va'asurin b'chadash milifnei ha'omer. So you're not allowed to eat chadash before the bringing of the korban homer. That's what our Mishnah had said. So minahani, did I skip something? Yeah. No, minahani mili, amar Reish Lakish asya lechem lechem imatza. So how do you know that the laws of chadash encompass all 5 grains? That's really the question. And the answer is that the word lechem is used by the laws of chadash, and the word lechem is used by the laws of matzah. Just like matzah encompasses the 5 grains, so too does the law of chadash. V'liktzor lifnei ha-pesach, and you're not allowed to harvest any of the 5 grains before the arrival of Pesach, and that the question is minahani mili. How do I know that? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan asya reishis mechala, because the law of the omer, the korban ha'omer barley being the first harvest, the word reishis is used in that pasuk. The word reishis is used in the context of challah. And since we established that challah applies to the 5 grains, the law of not harvesting anything before the barley for the korban ha'omer also applies to all 5 grains. Now, my koidem la'omer. So what does it mean that you're not allowed? This is the way some Meforshim explain. Rashi in one explanation explains it. The question that the Gemara is asking is, when the Mishnah says you're not allowed to eat from the 5 grains before the bringing of the omer, what does that really mean? So Rabbi Yona Omar Kodem Kitziras HaOmer, Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavdo Omar Kodem Havoas HaOmer. So Rabbi Yona says before you harvest the Omer, And Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda says before you actually bring the korban homer. Now this, if we're explaining it correctly, this is a surprising statement because we 2 days ago we established that everyone agrees that when the temple is standing, you cannot eat chadash before you actually bring the korban haomer. So how could Rabbi Yonah possibly say that you're allowed to eat chadash once you've harvested the omer? So the Gemara could have asked that question, but we'll see it's going to ask another question to prove that the way we're understanding it is incorrect. So Tanan, let's look at our Mishnah. Asurin b'chadash lifnei haomer v'liktzor lifnei hapesach. So what does our Mishnah say? It says you're not allowed to eat chadash before the omer, and you're not allowed to harvest before Pesach. Now, if you're going to tell me bishlam laman do'omer koidem havoas haomer haino delaka irev lehu v'tani lehu elo laman do'omer kodem ketziras haomer li'arvinu v'lisninu asurin b'chadash v'liktzor lifnei hapesach. He says, if you're going to tell me that the definition of the term that you're not allowed to eat chadash before the omer means before the harvesting of the omer, then it doesn't make any sense. Why does the Mishnah divide the two? If you're telling me that both halachas are the same, both eating chadash and harvesting chadash are both asur before you harvest the omer barley, then just say it in one statement. Say you're not allowed to harvest or eat chadash before the harvesting of the barley for the korban haomer. That's what the Mishnah should have said, but instead the Mishnah doesn't do that. It splits them up and it says you're not allowed to eat chadash before the omer sacrifice, and you're not allowed to harvest chadash before Pesach. So it seems like they're two disparate statements because they're two different trigger times. Right. One is at the time of harvesting the omer, and the other one is at the time of bringing the korban. So Ella I itmar aseifa itmar. So therefore, you're right. We got it totally wrong. That's not what they're not arguing about. When are you allowed to eat chadash? Because obviously you cannot eat chadash until you bring the actual korban haomer, and that's different from harvesting because you're allowed to harvest once you harvest the barley for the omer. So what really the machlokus is on the last part of the Mishnah, which is im hishrishu kodem laomer haomer matira, and on that my kodem laomer. The Mishnah had said in its last statement that as long as grain takes root before the omer, then you're allowed to consider that its chadash status is alleviated by the bringing of the korban haomer. So the question is, at what stage must it take root? Must it take root before you harvest the barley for the omer, or must it take root before you actually bring the korban haomer? Which is several hours difference. You can harvest already from the night time, the night before, and you don't bring the korban until, let's say, 12 hours later. So what if it took root in that interim period? That's really the question. So Rabbi Yonah Omar Koidem Havoas Omer, and Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda Omar Koidem Kitziras Omer. That's the machlokas. If it took root in between, so Rabbi Yonah says as long as it took root before you actually brought the korban, its status is alleviated. But according to Rabbi Yossi, if it didn't take root before you harvested the barley for the Omer sacrifice, and it only took root afterwards, then it's already too late, and you've got to consider it chadash until next year. Amar le Rabbi Elazar le Rabbi Yoshia de Dore lo teisev akarech ad mefarshas le lahai masnisin. So Rabbi Elazar the Amora says to Rabbi Yoshia, his colleague, his contemporary. In other words, there was another Rabbi Yoshia who was a late Tana. So we just want to clarify that when Rabbi Elazar was speaking, he was not speaking to the elder Rabbi Yoshia, he was speaking to his contemporary Rabbi Yoshia the Amora. He says, do not sit on your laurels until you explain the following Mishnah. Minayin la'omer shematir bahashrasha. So how do you know that as long as the grain takes root in the ground, that's enough for its chadash status to be alleviated by the bringing of the korban haomer? Minolan, so he says, what do you mean? Where do you know this from? Dichsiv, aviv, lav michlal di'ika de lav aviv. It's because when the Torah describes the barley for the omer, it says, aviv kalui ba'esh. It is from the spring harvest, right, the new spring harvest, and that implies that there's other grain growing out in the field that has not yet been part of the spring harvest because it's going to be part of the later harvest. So that implies that there's something that's just now taking root, but it hasn't grown into a harvestable product yet. And that's how I know that as long as it takes root, it can be alleviated. It doesn't have to fully grow. It can be alleviated of its chadash status even if it's just taken root. But wait a minute. Dilma delav aviv ula'olam da'il shlish. But my question is, how do you know that just taking root is sufficient? Okay, granted that the pasuk implies that it's not, there's other grain out there that's not harvestable that is affected by the korban ha'omer. But maybe it has to at least have grown a third of its way, which is at least considered to be somewhat grown for other halachic issues. Maybe that's what the pasuk means. So Ela Omar Shmuel mehachel chermesh, lav michlal deika de lav bar chermesh. So Shmuel says it's not from the pasuk of Aviv, but rather it's from the pasuk that says from the beginning of the sickle, which implies that the barley is the first thing that can have the sickle applied to it. That implies that there's other stuff that's growing that cannot be harvested by sickle, so that implies that it's not yet grown a third of its way. It's even earlier in its growth. So the Gemara says, but dilma delav bar chermesh ula olam shachas. Okay, fine. I can understand something not being subject to the sickle, but how do you know that it's so early that it's just taken root?
Right.
Maybe there's grass growing
Right.
that's not yet subject to the sickle, but there's still something coming out of the ground. So Amar Reb Yitzchak, kama, lav michlal de lav bar kama. But the pasuk also says that it's kama, which means that there's something straight and tall growing from the ground. So that's what the Torah implies. So therefore, there must be something that's not growing out of the ground yet, it's tall out of the ground, that is subject to alleviation of its chadar status, and that's how I know that taking root is sufficient. But wait a minute. Dilma delav bar kamu la'olam agam. But maybe the Torah still would require that it has to grow more than just taking root. It says kama, so that means it's not standing tall from the ground, but maybe it's just like a little buds of grass.
Ground,
It's broken ground.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what it needs to do. But just taking root means it's totally invisible to the topsoil. And you're still telling me that it's alleviated? So, Ella Amar Rava Asher Tizra Misha Zariah. So we have a pasuk in the context of the Shtei HaLechem, which talks about planting seeds. So what that implies is that the status of grain can be alleviated once it's been planted. And that's enough, both for the Korban HaOmer and for the Shtei HaLechem. So Amarle Rav Papa L'Rava, Ihachi Afal Gav Delo Hishrish Nami. Well, if that's the case, then why do you need it to take root? Just put seeds in the ground, and then they can be alleviated of their chadar status. So Amarle Sudni Basadek Siv. He said, smart one. Sudni, Rashi says, comes from the word sod. That a tzaddik or a Talmud Chacham knows the sod, knows the secrets. Another explanation of Sudni could mean a guy who manufactures date beer. And date beer, if you know how to manufacture correctly, is a sign that you're a smart person, or drinking it makes you smart. I'm not sure what exactly Rashi means.
It was his profession.
It was his profession, so he knew his malacha. But he says, but the Torah says basada. It says it has to be in the field. If you just put seeds in the ground, but they haven't taken root, it's not part of the field yet. And that's how I know that it at least has to have taken root.
There's no connection.
Right. So the final lesson is that if you know a guy named Sidney, you should show him respect. Anyway, have a good Erev Shabbos.